division of labor, when we begin to apply that to the study of food, we have several reminders. One is that women are generally the gatekeepers of the family food system. But are they always the decision makers? We need to consider that sort of thing. And I'm very struck with the challenge that we have on the topic around complementary food, because in the sexual division of labor, it's usually women that know the recipes, that know the special mixtures that are good for feeding a child, and also the mixtures that behave as indigenous medicines. So are we de-skilling women as we bring in these new products? Are we almost de-skilled women in the knowledge of breastfeeding, of hand expression? Will we do the same as we begin to see an increase in the use of commercial products? And you recall Michael's framework on the causes of malnutrition. I'm someone that has been very upset to see the box called CARE disappear out of programs simply because, well, not simply, but it's difficult to find indicators, it's difficult to define, and it's always culturally constructed. But what about the work of CARE? And how is that calculated? And how do we, how do we account for that? And how do we see that changing under conditions of modernity? So those are the kinds of questions we ask if we apply gender analysis to these sorts of questions. But gender analysis is not a feminist analysis. Gender analysis can leave us sometimes with saying, okay, here's the growth monitoring results, here's how men or boys are fed, here's how girls are fed. It's good gender analysis, but nobody's doing anything about it. I carry with me, in my mind, the definitions of feminism that come from South Asia. The one I favor and the one I use, I can't even attribute it to anyone anymore because it's in use so broadly. But even though we remind ourselves that feminisms are local and indigenous, and there's many, many in this room, a definition like this works for me. Feminism is theories and actions to end discrimination on the basis of gender, class, race, and ethnicity. So our South Asian feminists do not allow us to separate gender from class and from race. So what a challenge that is to us. Our gender analysis from a feminist perspective requires us to keep these other dimensions in front as well. Feminism, whether this complementary feeding and continued breastfeeding is a feminist issue, also involves that decision which is very basic to feminism, and that is that it requires praxis or practical action. You can't just look at these subjects in the abstract. You have to do something about it. And for that reason, I think that all our discussions on complementary feeding are going to be informed by a feminist analysis. Feminism also brings us the concept of experiential knowledge. That is, it's not just the technical knowledge we need, not just the expert knowledge. It's women's knowledge of their own body. It's women's knowledge of their own food, their child, the knowledge that comes connected to the stories that we all have concerning breastfeeding mothers. Within a feminist framework, this is acceptable. These are not anecdotes. This is one of the ways to learn about this subject and to make changes. And if we had time, I would tell you my stories, you would tell me yours, and we would expect that, and the knowledge would be valued, particularly, as we'll hear in our other presentations, experiential knowledge of indigenous foods. So that's got to be sort of kept in there. And in several cases, what I actually draw from feminism is something, a jargon, but we've had other people's jargon, so you can have my jargon. Discourse and discourse analysis. Feminists remind us that language is extraordinarily important, and we get that first from being very sensitive to sexist language and trying to keep some of our discussions sometimes gender neutral when that's important too. But I think several of our speakers have reminded us that we need to be conscious of choosing our words. So when I use the word discourse, and as you see discourse written in feminist work, it's an overused word, but what it is really is it's a combination of talk and documents and definitions and language and emails back and forth about a subject. So the discourse includes the way we talk about something and the way we write about something. So I think that's got to be extremely important as we begin to think about things like avoiding terms like prolonged breastfeeding, or the discussions that we have to have about words like weaning or sevrage or even rights. And more important perhaps is to be very conscious of who uses the language for what purpose. We can choose to make our own definitions and keep those right in the forefront.